Uh, Welcome everyone to this evening's event. I'm Scott Edgar. I'm the Assistant Arts and Cultural Programmer at the Linnenhall Library in Belfast. For those of you unfamiliar with the library, we're the oldest such institution in the city, and we're the only library in Ireland that still generates a proportion of our income from membership. So if you enjoy this evening's event, please do visit our website and find out more about how you can become a member. For now, like I said, I'll place everyone on mute. If you've got questions or comments for our guests tonight, then please type them into the chat box and we will get back to them at the end if time permits. At the Linnenhall Library, we are the custodians of the Northern Ireland Political Collection. That's an archive of over 350,000 items relating to turbulent years in Belfast and beyond. The collection began back in 1968 when then librarian Jimmy Vitti picked up a leaflet for a civil rights event in the city centre. Over the following decades, the collection grew into hundreds of thousands of artifacts, including newspapers, pamphlets, manifestos, posters, t-shirts, audiovisual material, and other ephemera. And with us tonight, we have Councillor Billy Hutchinson and author and researcher Dr Gareth Mulvenna. Gareth has worked as a parliamentary researcher in the Northern Ireland Assembly and held a visiting research fellowship at Queen's University, Belfast School of Politics. The two men have come together to work on the recently published My Life in Loyalism, which is a remarkable story of Billy's life from a member of Tartan gangs in the Shankill area of Belfast to leader of the Progressive Unionist Party and a member of Belfast City Council. And for the remainder of the evening, I'll just ask you to show our respect and our usual Linnenhall library levels of appreciation for our guests. And I will hand you over to Councillor Billy Hutchinson and first Dr. Gareth Mulvenna.
Okay, thanks very much, Scott. It's great to be doing this talk. Did a talk last year for the Political Collection on the Loyalist News. So it's great to be invited to speak again about Billy's life story. Really, the format of the evening will be I'll ask Billy some questions. He'll talk about some of the issues in the book, and we'll hopefully get some questions at the end. But just to give a brief sort of background for people who don't know, I wrote a book on the Tartan gangs called Tartan Gangs and Paramilitaries. It came out 5 years ago. Billy was one of the people who kindly gave up his time to be interviewed for that book, and it was actually at one of the book launches in Shankill Road Library in October 2016 that Billy approached me after that meeting and said that he decided to do his life story. So that was in October 2016, and in November 2020 the book My Life in Loyalism was published by Marion Press, and people can buy their copies of that in local bookshops or on Amazon or Waterstones. So really, just to kick things off, I'll ask the most obvious question that people will probably want to know the answer to, and that is, Billy, why did you decide that now, or in the recent years, was the time to write the book about your life story?
Well, I think it's, the reason I decided this was I had a book back in the late 90s, and the book had been sort of withdrawn by the publisher because he was concerned about some of the content I had in it. And obviously I learned very quickly that legal people don't allow you to say whatever you want to say. And then if you try to say it in another way, they accuse you of jigsawing, which I didn't know about. But anyway, so I've always wanted the book to come out. So that book was shelved, and I think it's lying behind me here. It's never seen the light of day. But I just felt that, some sort of narrative needed to be out there by loyalists. I was concerned about the books that had been written about loyalists before. And I just didn't understand what they were supposed to be about. And I'm talking about ones that was written by journalists or other authors. So I just thought that I wanted to get out the narrative that I knew. And the reason for the title of the book was it was only about my life. So it was about what I would have known or understood. And so that's why I did it. But I do think that, there's more books need to be written about loyalism. And I think that because there's lots of positive stories out there. So what I try to do is just explain my life in loyalism. And so I'm happy with the outcome of the book. I'm happy with the reviews I got, and so I was glad I did it.
Okay, so you were born in December 1955. Can you give some people who might not understand, the context of your early life, what it was like to be a young boy on the Shankill in the 1960s?
Well, I mean, I think the Shankill was, I suppose, in many ways believed that they were the heart of the empire, and I think that the difficulty was that by the time we get the mid 60s or just after that, I think that the empire was gone, or at least it was crumbling at that stage. But I mean, I grew up in the Shankill, and I keep hearing people and telling me that we were part of the Protestant ascendancy and we had everything we needed. But I, like others who lived in the Shankill, if people want to admit to it, under a unionist government, were discriminated. Our families were discriminated as anybody else was discriminated against. That was never recognised. People had a job, they were working for less money than other people would have been working in different jobs. But so from my point of view, growing up, I grew up in a loving family, but my mother went to the mill with my grandmother in their bare feet. And it was poverty, and I remember not that long. Well, it was probably about 15 years ago. Two women who knew me, they were older women, and they called me over to see this photographic expedition, and they showed me the photos and said, "That's your granny and your mother. They were the good old days." And I said, "I know, I see that. They're going to work. They're away to work in the mill. They didn't have a shoe in their foot." So it was that whole thing. So the poverty was there, and it was hard for people from a Republican background, and I'm talking about Republicans here because when I used to speak to Republicans, they used to think that we were from the ascendancy, and I used to tell them about poverty, and they just didn't believe it. So from that point of view, it was no different for us in the Shankill in terms of that. And people were ostracized in the Shankill if they didn't have a job, and people were expected to work for less money and stuff, because it was supposed to be a Protestant state for Protestant people, which it never was. It may have been for those people who could get a motorway built to their door and then just stop it there so they could get back and forth from Stormont, but it wasn't for everybody else. So from my point of view, I grew up like that. And the other thing about growing up in the Shankill was that I was from a mixed marriage. My mother was a unionist, my father was a socialist. And so I heard all the stories about things, and my father always argued with my mother because she would have went and represented people that the unionists and stuff like that. And he used to talk about key money. Now, I never understood any of this because I was too young. But when you get into your teens and you start to understand things, then you realize some of the things that were said, and then you start to understand what they are. I suppose one of the prominent things was that when Paisley was coming to open an arch in Russell Street, before I went to school, my father said to me, "Hope you're not going to do that tonight. Stay away from that man." And he used the term demagogue, which I hadn't got a clue what it was. I hadn't got a clue. And he also used the term to me and said, "Stay away from him because he would fight the last drop of our blood." And I heard that said by others, but it was later on in my teenage years, and it was later on when I was in the case. In fact, Gusty said the same thing. So it was just all of that. And, just to give a funny story about, growing up in the Shankill, and Gusty told me a story. Gusty had come back from one of the conflicts. I can't remember which one it was, but it was in the 60s. And he was a sergeant in the military police. And when he came back, he went into the bookies in the Shankill. And these two boys from the Shankill were arguing over who owned Australia. And this guy says, "Well, ask Gusty. He knows. He's been all around the world." And he said to Gusty, "Don't we own Australia?" And Gusty says, "Yes, but the only problem is none of the two have a nurse in your trousers." Making the point that, it doesn't go right down to people who live in working class areas just because you own another place. So that was my experience. My experience was a very working class one. It was one of poverty. It was one of seeing, my grandmother having to take the straw out of the mattresses and go to the stable in Downing Street with the straw and exchange it for fresh straw, put it back in and use a darning needle to close it up. Going to the pawn, on a Monday with my grandfather's 3-piece suit, putting it in and getting it back out on Friday for him. that was the things that I seen. Pawn shops were on nearly every corner, and at that stage, now I think there's probably two, one on the Beersbridge Road and one here, one on the Shore Road, and I think they're owned by the same person. So that was my experience in terms of all of that, and so I grew up, in that sort of background, humble background, but it didn't affect me in any way. I mean, I knew it was there, I knew what was going on. I didn't understand politics at that stage, but then, later on, I was trying to work out what people were talking about in terms of, the whole notion of civil rights, because I was going, do we not have them? Where are the civil rights for people? And I still argue this today in the council, with Republicans who are saying they're going to do this and do that about rights, and I'm going, can we have some, please? Because we don't have them, and that's the issue. We need to have a society where the rights work for everybody, and not just for one section. And it just can't work for working class people or for loyalists or Republicans. It has to work for everybody, including those people who are middle class or people who own their own businesses. Everybody has to have rights. And I think the difficulty in this country is particularly people from a loyalist or Republican background don't recognise that if you have rights, you're supposed to have responsibilities as well. So it's how you actually handle those rights. But I'm just saying that because that's what I grew up in. My father was a socialist and my mother was a unionist. So I'd heard things growing up, didn't really know what they were, and then I tried to work them out later on. Whenever I started to understand some of the things it said or some of the words it said, but it matched into what others were telling me as well. So that's how I grew up in the Shangle.
So I'm thinking there, 1966. Obviously, you mentioned Gusty already, but in 1966 you have the shooting of Peter Ward at Malvern Street, and obviously you were only 10 years old at the time. But do you remember how the Shangle community reacted to the emergence of the UVF at that time? Was there feeling of support, or did they not agree with what the UVF were doing?
Well, I mean, I think that there was. Well, let me put it like this: I was 10-year-old. My grandmother lived in Fourmont Street, which came out onto Malvern Street. So it was just around the corner from the bar, and all these things were appearing on the wall about Gusty and about others, and about the UVF as well, but about Gusty in the main. People weren't always open about, their views, but there seemed to be an openness around that they were supporting them. Now we have to remember, and again, I wasn't necessarily conscious of this at the time, but it was the 50th anniversary of Easter Rising and the 50th anniversary of the Somme. One thing I do know is that people did talk about the First World War in my community, and so there was a lot of tension, and I know. Well, I don't know, but I'm assuming that people didn't support it, but I'm assuming others did. Now, the Hammer would have been a very tight-knit community, and there was other tight-knit communities within that, because Gusty came from the banjo, and we had the Hammer. So they were all working-class men, probably working in the shipyard or, in some other metal polishing engineering companies. So that's, that would be the thing. So my grandmother used to walk me up past the wall, which was facing the Malvern pub, and there's all these slogans on the wall and stuff like that. And then I would have heard my granny talk to my mother, and we would have been talking about that there'd been a lot of support, for this, because the IRA were recruiting in Ardoyne and stuff like that. Going back to that and thinking about all of that, I don't know why that was true. If we read some of the history books, it's true, and if we read other history books, it isn't. So it's a question, but it wasn't just the Malvern Street shootings. There were other shootings and attempted shootings in the Old Park, and I can remember that one of the IRA figures at the start of the Troubles had been in '66, was recruiting in Ardoyne because it was the 50th anniversary of Easter Rising, and I suppose if you wanted to recruit people into the IRA, it wouldn't have been a bad time to do it. I think it's the same with the UVF in terms of the Somme, because that sort of whole history of the First World War was very prevalent in the communities. So yes, there was people who would have supported it, but I'm assuming also there were people who wouldn't have supported it. But I think that the ones who supported it were very vocal, and they were also putting slogans in the wall so it could be seen. Those who weren't were keeping quiet and weren't really saying anything.
one thing that people often ask me about when they're talking about your life is, you know, a lot of the people I interviewed for Tartan gangs and other people who would have been of your generation who ended up in the UVA for the Red Hand or the UDA, a lot of them went through the experience of being in the Loyal Orders, the Orange or the Black or whatever, as young men. That never really played a sort of role in your early life. Can you explain to people why that was?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, my father wouldn't have wanted me to do that, but I mean, and that's why he told me not to go near the arch in Russell Street, because Billy was opening it. But I mean, like, there were bonds in the street. We celebrated the 12th and the 11th. We had street parties in the street. There were streamers put up across from each house. And there was always a street party and a bonfire. And like, I lived next to Waste Ground, and we collected bonfire wood, but we kept it in people's backyards, and we didn't bring it out until we were finished school. And then, you know, you stayed out all night to guard bonfire wood and stuff like that, and you went and raided other areas, bonfire wood and stuff like that. But the older guys were always there to look after you, the ones who would have stayed out and stuff like that. So that whole sort of culture of the 12th was there. I can't remember seeing a 12th because I was always up late to watch a bonfire and never got up the next day. But used to see them coming home, but I wouldn't have seen them going, if you know what I mean. So, so from that point of view, it wasn't in my DNA, but it was part of the culture in terms of living on the Shankill and living in the streets that I lived in. The same as, you know, troops returning from different conflicts and not being able to get houses and stuff like that. And then, you know, so, and knowing those guys who live in the street, like I had one family who lived facing me that I used to hang about with, the kids, and 5 children. Every one was born in a different part of the world because he was in the signals, and his family was with him the whole time. So it seemed to me like one was born in Malta, and one was born in Singapore, one was born in Ballymena, and you know, I can't remember where the other 2 were born, but it wasn't definitely in the UK. So from that point of view, you know, you had that in the street as well, and you had all that talk. But look, you know, the bonfire was always great, and everybody made sure it was trouble free, and the women in the street, the mothers or whatever, would have actually had a party, and they, you know, we've got boxes of crisps and bottles of juice and stuff like that, like orange, you know, fizzy juice. And the Great Northern wasn't that far from us, so the lemonade factory was probably about a quarter of a mile away. So they always went to the end because most of the women worked on bottling the lemonade and stuff. So, but we always had that, and then there was always a rivalry, and I can see Eddie Kinner on the thing, you know, but there was always a rivalry who could have the biggest bonfire, and they weren't as big as the ones they built now. I think some of these people are engineers the way they build them, because well, the ones that don't tumble over, I think, are engineers. So yeah, try to have the biggest bonfire, and it was always that competition. But you know, it was very localized, and it was enjoyable. I always enjoyed it. You know, I had never any complaints about it. I collected the bonfire. We had built the bonfire. I went to the parties. We always blew the flag outside the door and stuff like that, and streamers. And I suppose my father probably wouldn't have wanted to do that, but you know, I suppose he had to, because my mother probably said, "Well, I am doing it," and the two of them recognised the different sort of views politically, and I think they just had to compromise and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, bringing it up to the sort of late 60s now, really this is to sort of give people an idea of how things began to change. And recently I've been reading a bit about the Scarman Tribunal about August 1969. And, you know, that's when you begin to see trouble. Well, the Junior Orange March being attacked at Unity Flats, and then there's mention of Linfield supporters and residents of Unity Flats having altercations. You would have been like, you know, sort of 14, yeah, about becoming 14 at that stage, so you were becoming more of a young man. Can you remember how things began to change in 1969 and how that maybe pushed you more towards sort of what the Tartan gangs would have become and eventually paramilitarism? Can you talk about that atmosphere?
Yeah, well, the thing was after that, I mean, 69 was famous for rumours and stories, and you know what I mean? So for instance, you know, I can remember people saying they're attacking us from Hooker Street in the Woodville, and other people, you know, down the Shankill, rumours are coming up that they were attacking up Dover Street and Percy Street and all of that. Now, you know, in terms of whether that was real or not real, it was rumours from my point of view, because you could never substantiate it. And sometimes you turned up at places to see what was going on, and it wasn't going on, or it was going on elsewhere. But it's just how the rumours went about. And there was rumours of hundreds of people being killed and stuff like that, and we know that wasn't the case in terms of August '69. But you know, I think the thing was that those 2 areas that I just mentioned, you know, it did break out there, and there was fighting, and you know, people were killed, but there wasn't hundreds of people killed. And I know one guy was shot in the face, and he with a shotgun. He was a Protestant, but was shot by a Catholic, and he ended up blind. But you know, so it was all these things, and everybody will have their stories about what happened in '69. But my view of it was that the politics was wrong in the first place, you know, and with that being wrong, then I think that unionism, in a sense, working class unionists, didn't like what was going on. They didn't know what was going on because they weren't being told by the politicians. And I think that after we get through '69, I think the problem is that then vigilantes start to turn up, and I know in my own community in the Shankill, the vigilantes were there, and they were running about with big lumps of wood or walking sticks or whatever to protect themselves, and they made sort of barbed wire fences brought across the state to stop people from coming down and bombing or shooting, and that went on for a while. But you know, so people did feel that they were at risk. And people did go out and do that sort of vigilante stuff later on. It wasn't '69, it was probably about 70, 71. You know, we had the disarm the RUC, and then, you know, it was all that sort of stuff, you know, the political stuff, as it all went wrong from a unionist point of view. I think that, you know, so the thing just intensified and intensified. We had politicians who talked about blood running down the streets. Yeah, you know, and those were the sorts of things that were happening. So young people were hearing this, and young people were seeing the news, and it looked like, you know, things were, you know, unionism was being sort of trampled on. But you know, the whole point about all of this is like, it depends on what side of the fence you're on. The story I'll tell, but I'm telling the story as I knew it. But for me, it was when sort of, you know, the IRA bombings were going off, and they were killing people in our community, that actually had an impact on me, because it looked like that the you know, nobody was going to do anything about it, and the British government looked to be telling any soldiers that they brought in to keep the peace, their hands behind their back, in terms of how they were going to behave. They were going, you know. So at that stage, I think that it intensified because of bombs, and you know, 2 bombs that I remember, you know, was the Baltimore showroom. And in those days, when, you know, now they put tents and stuff up, and they have bags you can't see into, but then, you know, the ambulance people who were able were putting them in the clear bags, and you could see, you know, limbs and stuff like that off their bombs. And the 2, well, Baltimore showroom was one, and the other one was the 4-step in. And in there was 2 characters who were killed, and both of them were pretty old, and they were well known in the Shankill, and they went out for a drink, and bomb was planted, no warning, and they were killed. In the Baltimore showroom, I didn't know at the time, but I actually ended up knowing, you know, people who had been blown up in it. And there was an 18-month-old baby. There was also, I think it was a 5-year-old boy, and then there was a Catholic who was blown up in it as well, which was all quite strange. And it was a showroom for furniture, so it wasn't anything else. But, you know, so in those early days, it was the bombs and stuff. And, you know, I suppose for me at that particular time, I was starting to say, well, if the army and the British government aren't going to do anything about this, then, you know, somebody needs to defend the area. And there were vigilantes and all then, but, you know, they weren't defending it. And so at that stage, I got involved at a very young age, 71, yet 71 or whatever. It would have been sort of like summer 71. And I just took it into my own head that I needed to do something. So I set up my own paramilitary organisation because I didn't believe the DUF existed. I believed that they were writing on the wall. And then I think it was 71 when the UDA was formed. But, you know, so that's the sort of things I was doing. And, you know, so from that point of view, you know, it was getting worse. It wasn't getting any better. It didn't look to be like anybody was trying to solve it. The politicians certainly weren't trying to solve it. In fact, they were trying to make it worse. But the difficulty was, you know, I remember what my father had said. He died the last drop of your blood. It also happened with the rest of the politicians. They'd done the same thing, and they certainly didn't allow their children or anybody else to get involved, and they sent them off to private schools and universities, which some of us didn't have the luxury of being able to do. So from that point of view, you know, the troubles had just started. It started to intensify. We all know about sort of Bloody Friday and stuff like that, intensified, McGurk's Bar, and you know, all those other things. And I can remember when the bomb went off McGurk's Bar, and there was all these old fellas used to hang about the corner where I lived, and you used to just hang about and listen to them, and used to say, "You go away," and you just stood at the other corner. You could hear everything they were saying, you know, and they were talking about McGurk's Bar, and they were saying, "Well, that was an OG. They were making a bomb, you know, in McGurk's." It was all that sort of stuff. And we know that didn't happen, but that was the sort of things people were saying. So you were getting more rumor rather than truth. And so from that point of view, you know, that's where you were at that time. But anyway, I set the organisation up, and then I was approached. This was 71. I was at a Linfield match, and these two guys stopped me, and they said to me, "We want you to do us a favour." And I said, "Who are you?" And they said, "Well, we're from the UVF." And I said, "You're not from the UVF." I said, You're only writing the wall, you run away, so you haven't done anything yet." And that's what I said. But anyway, so I said to me, "Well, okay, will you do a favour for us?" And I said, "What is it you want?" And they asked me to make sure the next week, when we're coming back with football, that nobody stopped at Unity Flats, that everybody kept it on up the road. And I said, I'll do that, that's no problem, that's easy. And it was a test. But anyway, so I got a guy who I knew went to matches with me, and I knew that he just would never keep quiet. He'd always say something. So I told him, and I said to the guy, I said, "Look, see next week when we're coming up, we can't stop at Unity Flats." And he says, "Why?" I said, "You need to get the word round, but don't do it the Saturday when we're on our way back." And he said to me, "Why?" And I says, "Well, something's going to happen." I says, "We can't stop there." He says, "What is it?" I says, "I can't tell you, I don't know, but something's going to happen." And he says, "Why?" And I says, "Because," I said, "there's people who are going to do something, and we don't want to be about it at the time." So anyway, by the time I got round and we got to Unity Flats, everybody thought somebody was going to do a shooting or there was going to be a bombing. So everybody got up, and we got up on the last Townsend Street on the Shangle, and the two boys walked out to me and they said to me, "How'd you do that?" I said, "You told me to do it and I done it. Do you need to know why or how?" So I wouldn't tell them. But anyway, that's how I did it. So it was just to talk to the biggest mouthpiece in the group, and he put the word around, so everybody got up. And they were fascinated about what I had done, but I wouldn't tell them that that's how easy it was. But anyway, so they had been trying to get me because they knew that I had a group. They also knew that the group had got arms and stuff like that. So anyway, so they by the time September came, they had given me evidence that these people existed, and therefore the group that I had between September 71 and April 72, we went into the organisation. But we did it like so many people at a time, and I was working with them to control all of it. The thing about it was that you know, the UVF was hiding inside another organisation, and the reason why they were hiding inside the other organisation was because everybody knew that this organisation had been either run by MI5 or the people who were in it from Northern Ireland were operating for MI5. I'm not going to mention their names, but I would know if I mentioned at least two people, everybody would know who they were because they were in public life. But, you know, and that was the issue. You know, the issue for me was where were they, and that's what they were doing. So they were in gathering intelligence about whether weapons were held so they could take them all. and they were also trying to find out who the people were that were working for MI5, and they found out both, not all of it, but they found out both of those things. So that then UVF came out in April 72 and decided that, you know, it always existed, but they, after 66, they regrouped and started to go in and infiltrate other groups so they could get the weapons. So that's where I was at that particular time, and that's what I was doing.
I think you mentioned there, obviously, setting up an organization in 1971, and to give people sort of context, you would have been 15 at the time, and you wouldn't have turned 16 till that Christmas. So, looking at it now, I suppose, how do you feel? How can you explain to people what it was like to be a 15-year-old boy, basically, but being in that position where you're meeting people to buy arms and going to explosive bomb making classes and stuff, and doing those things that don't come naturally to a 15-year-old boy? Can you talk a wee bit about the human aspect of it?
Well, I mean, one of the things, the human aspect, thing about it was I was at school, and coming home from school, the army and the police were waiting at a bus stop to arrest me, and anyway, somebody else who would have been, he wasn't in the group, but he would have been close to me, actually warned me, and I got away. And and at that time I'm walking up Crimea Street, like, thinking, what am I bloody doing? Not doing this. And I questioned myself, but for whatever reason, I just kept going on that path, and it was one, because I thought it was the right way, it was the right thing to do, because nobody else was doing it. But that doesn't mean to say I didn't question myself. One of the things that I learned very quickly was that I had to protect myself. And when I say that, what I had to do was I had to, and I know there's a psychiatrist on this, so he's probably analysing me here. But what I had to do was to try to protect myself by and I didn't know this at the time, but I realised as I went through life that I kept having these coping mechanisms, where I was able to cope. So I never got close to people. I kept people at arm's length. I may have got close to a couple of people, but I didn't get close to everybody. I didn't trust people. I didn't trust myself in terms of, who can I trust? And I lived my life like that, until I went to prison. And I suppose even in prison, I had lots of friends and stuff like that. But, you always had to, and even in prison, you had to have a coping mechanism. You can't, I could never have operated without having coping mechanisms and knowing in my head what I needed to do next or how I needed to protect myself. And, because, it's a bloody war and you're involved in it, and you can't justify it. And I wouldn't try to justify it to anybody other than myself, but I need to justify things in my own head. I also need to realise, how to protect myself and how to do it. And it didn't become easy, but it became something that I just did. And I don't believe it was innate. I just believe that, questioning myself, all the time actually allowed me to do that. And, even today, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't go about with a group of friends. I have friends and I talk to them all the time, and some of them's online here. But, I do my politics. I have to sort of talk to people. I have to build relationships with people in the council to do it. Doesn't matter where they're from. I still have to build relationships with them, because to get things across the line. And at home, like, when I go home, I just do what I do in the house, and I get up the next day and I start all over again and still, do the same things. I believe in fitness and stuff like that. And, so, I think, I'll probably, that's just the type of person I am. Lots of people will call me a loner and things like that, and think that I do it for a reason. I don't. It's just, I will socialize with people. I'll do all sorts of things, but I don't really sort of see the same people every day or every night. You know what I mean? And there's people when I see them, like, I have that real bond with them and love them as if they were my brother. But I don't actually see them enough and stuff like that. So, but I think it's how this affects you. It's about, one, when you're on the outside, protecting yourself, and then two, when you're on the inside, actually being able to sort of get through that whole system and get out the other end without being twisted. Because it's important, you know, that you actually, and in fairness, and we'll probably talk about that a bit later, we had a brilliant system in Lancaster which kept us mentally alert and also physically alert. And it was the best thing you could ever have done.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, you know, during this early period before we talk about Lancaster, one of the things, I mean, you talked there earlier about it being about your life in loyalism, and that's why you called the book My Life in Loyalism. But one of the things you always said to me was that you wanted to give credit to other people as well. And there's people mentioned in the book, like Billy Spence, Jim McDonald, Billy Mitchell, Tommy West, Jim Hanna, Frenchie Marchant, people who others might have heard of in fleeting mentions and histories of the Troubles, or might not have heard of at all. Can you talk about why it was so important to you to talk about people like that in the book and give credit to them?
Well, I mean, I think it's important for people to understand loyalism, and also about understanding some of those characters. And I had been with them. Now, the difficulty was that they all thought I was much older than I was. That was the difficulty. I must have looked really old or something, I don't know. But most people thought that I was very feminine looking because I had long hair. And many times people thought I was a girl. Talking about older people, of course, you know, thought I was a girl and would have said, all right, love, you know. But, you know, so from that point of view, they always thought that I was much older than I was. And because of the context that I had and because of, you know, what I had done, they would have sort of confided in me and wanted to talk to me and stuff like that. So I just felt that those people who I mentioned did contribute. Now, I know that not everybody will agree with that, but my problem is, you know, that's why it's about my life. I was talking about people who I knew, and I talked about, you know, what they did and what they didn't do in terms of, you know, that they were good people, they were leaders and all of that. But not everybody will agree with you, and that's the sort of wonders of the book. So I didn't write it about the UVF. I didn't write it about the Troubles. I wrote it about my life in the Troubles. And that was the whole point. And, you know, it's like a car crash. You know, if four of us are walking down the road and there's a car crash, you know, three of us will probably give different sort of how to see it, you know, so different views of how you see it. And, you know, that's life. You know, everybody will not remember it in the same way. So that's why I made it clear that, and you know this, that's why I wanted to call the book My Life in Loyalism. And I think we had a number of titles. I think that was the one you came up with in the end. But the point about it was, that's all it was about. I wasn't there to talk about, you know, the history of UVF. Somebody else will write that at some stage, and I'm quite happy to do it. It was just about my life in loyalism and the people who I met, and the people who I thought, you know, were good people. And that's why I did it. Now, not everybody agrees with it. I don't want people to agree with it. It's my view. Doesn't mean to say it's right, but it is right in my own head, and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's important, you know, because the difficulty with all of this is, and it's the same, and we'll get on that probably later, the politics, you know, it's, you know, if you read history books, we hear about the people, you know, who were up front, where it was the kings or where it was the prime ministers or where it was politicians or where it was, you know, lords or whatever. You'll hear about them all. But, you know, who are the people behind all of that? You know, you don't never hear about them. And they're probably the people who allowed things to happen and made things happen, if you see what I mean. So from my point of view, that's what I'm talking about. You know, in '73, the UVF called a ceasefire to try to actually get the whole thing stopped. The official IRA, I think, if I remember correctly, met with the UVF at that time, and they agreed that they would do a ceasefire, and the provisionals turned it down. Now, you know, the reality about that was, you know, that they were planning the long war, and they were also planning to get the British government to sort of not surrender, but to say all the things that happened during the Troubles. You know, the Troubles went on far too long because there wasn't people in the political sphere who were trying to bring it to an end. You know, we had people in communities, you know, we had peace people and everybody else who tried to bring it, you know, to an end. And obviously they contributed along the way. You know, so there was lots of people, trade unions were the same, and church groups and all the rest of it. So it was all of that work, come together, which culminated in '94. But the point I'm making is that, all of that needed to happen. And I know Eddie Kinner is somewhere there on the thing, but when me and Eddie Kinner and the late Billy Mitchell had been working on ceasefires for a long time, and we were talking about how to do what we needed to do in terms of trying to get people to do it. And the difficulty with all of that was, I remember the Mennonites approaching. I think it was me and Eddie and Billy Mitchell, and we went to see them. The Quakers organised a meeting, the Mennonites, and the Mennonites said, "Tell us what you're doing." And we told them, and they said, "Oh, we're going to give you a language for this." So we were happy. We were doing the practice, or we were doing all the work on the ground, but they just give us a theory, which actually made it even better, if you know what I mean. Because if you wrote it up with a theory, then it makes it. And I remember, and I can't remember what we called them, Eddie, but we did call. So we were talking about middle management in the UVF. You needed to get them to agree and all the rest of it. And when we met the Mennonites, we were telling them what we're doing. They says, "No, they're called insider partials." Now, and that's a term from conflict transformation. You know what I mean? But we didn't have any of that. We just did it off our own gut and got on with it. So from that point of view, what I'm saying to you is that that's why I like some of these other people, because these other people had tried in '73 to bring stuff about, and it didn't happen. And then we kept on going on and on and on until I'll talk about that in a long case. But the first time I got involved in the peace process was back in '86. But I'll explain that when we get to long case, if you want.
Yeah, so just to talk about, obviously you end up being incarcerated in 1974, October '74, and then in '75 you go to Long Kesh. Can you talk about how being in Long Kesh and meeting up with Gusty again, how that started a process of politicization for people like yourself and Eddie Kinner and people like Flint and every Marty Snodden, other people who went through that system, Plum as well. Can you talk about that sort of the University of Long Kesh idea?
Yeah, well, that I met Gusty when he was kidnapped. Anyway, so I met him and I knew what he had planned on the outside. And when he was in Crumlin Road, when he got rearrested and went back into Crumlin Road, they moved the loyalist prisoners. I can't remember whether it was September, October. It was right about that time anyway. In '72, they took him out in helicopters and took him down to Long Kesh. I know Professor Tony Novosol's on there. I can see him. So he wrote a book, so he will probably know those dates. But so when I was on remand in Crumlin Road, and so I was the OC of the jail at the time, and then when I got sentenced, I went down to Long Kesh, and I was in Complaint 18 where Gusty was, and the system that they had was unbelievable. It was second to none. And Gusty did this, and the reason why he did it, and the reason why he had that system was because he believed that if you allow any jail system to allow the strongest to go against the weakest, then that's what happens. That's how you get tobacco barons and you get all these other things. So he prevented that by creating the whole special category status, along with other people like Provost. And then when they were in Long Kesh, Gusty set up a system. So he had an education system where people could do open university, they could do O levels, A levels, they could do informal education, and he also got them a library. So any compound could have a library. So the UVF compounds all had libraries. They had a librarian who went and met the education officer and said, "Here's a request for a number of books." And then, obviously it went above his head because he had to hand them in to security, and of course, they refused to let you do books. And at one stage, I had applied to do Soviet history, and they turned me down because I wanted to do Soviet history. And this was in the late '70s, early '80s. So it's that sort of stuff. It was sort of they would always have tried to sort of stop you from doing what you did. There was also a view in the prison that we shouldn't allow these people to be educated, and it wasn't about rehabilitation, but it was about punishment. But the special category system, which The provost had everybody else had. We all had it in the conference. It worked and it worked well. So Gusty there was a camp council made up of each of the organisations, and so they had a no sort of strike policy. In other words, I could end up in the van going to a visit or going to a hospital or going to a doctor's, and 6 provosts could get into it. So they kick a crap out of you, like. So the agreement was you weren't allowed to do that, and if you did, then the UVFRA would deal with it. So there was no conflict in the prison, and that's how it worked. So it worked for everybody. The same with prison officers. You weren't allowed to get involved in conflict of any description with prison officers. So it was a question of no lifting your hands, and if they're antagonising you, just switch off. But of course, one time, this prison officer was antagonising me like mad, and he said, I can't remember what it was he said, but I turned around and said to him, yeah, I know, and I quoted, George Bernard Shaw, who said a prostitute married a prison officer and brought him down to her level. And I said that to him, and he reported me to the governor. So the governor came up and said, what did you say? And I told him what I said. And he says, that's not what he told us. And I said, that's what I said. I says, ask anybody else who was about. So that called in the principal officer, and he said, that's exactly what he said. And I said, so what is the issue here? I said, he was talking about me, and he said something about my mother. And I just put it back to him. But anyway, but there was no, it was all sorted out, and there was, the governor just said to me, away you go, because he knew that we wouldn't lift our hands, like, because we weren't allowed, because he didn't allow you. So that whole system was set up, so there's this nonsense about that loyalists pump iron, and Republicans studied. The official IRA studied, we studied. There was one person, if I'm right, and Eddie Kinner can keep me right here, there was one person in New Day, who was John Waite, who studied, and he studied economics. And I did A-level politics with him, and it was during the miners' strike. And of course, he was supporting Thatcher, and we were supporting the miners, which was quite interesting because he was the only one who was supporting him, and the lecturer was the only 2 supporting Thatcher on our policies, and we were opposed to them. But so we grew up in that whole thing where Gusty encouraged us to exercise our brain and to exercise our body, and that's what he allowed us to do. Now, lots of people in the conference probably didn't like the idea, but the idea was, this is what you do. You can do it if you like, or you don't do it. But you can do handicrafts, whatever it is you want to do. So he supplied all of this stuff to people, and a lot of people actually benefited from it and used it. And I see people now, who would stop me, and they're the same age as me, and stop me and say, you know what, we never got it, but see, 3 years after I was out, I worked it out, and I was going, there you are. But it took them, the whole time they were in prison, they couldn't work out what Gusty was doing or why he was doing it. And 3 years after they were out, they worked it out. And I see them 17 years later, and they're telling me it was a great system, and it was. I mean, I think that Plum Smith and Flint McCulloch were the first 2 to start the Open University, and that was back in 72, 73, because they went down there in 72 about the autumn time, and they started doing university. And I think that in the compound I was in alone, there were 19 people who either had a BA, a master's degree, or were doing PhDs. And so it doesn't sort of stand up that we weren't studying. And Republicans used to say that they didn't study because it was a British plot, and point about it was like we were free to study. If you were studying university, as I did, and I know Eddie Kinner did, your tutor came in And I remember this female tutor came in to do me, and I was doing a design course because I was studying design and stuff like that. And I wanted to be a planner, and she came in to talk to me about this course, and she was very, very nervous. And we were in the study hut, and the prison officer came in. It was a really sunny day, and he opens his tunic and takes his hat off. And then he says to me, "Hutch, I'm away." It says, "Too warm. I'm going to sit outside in the chair." And I could see her face, she was panicking. So I said, I said, "Hold on, I'm out." And I said, "You need to come back in." He says, "Why?" And I said, "Because the tutor isn't comfortable." And I says, "And I'm not going to get through this tutorial if you don't come back in." So he said, "You come back in." And when I sat down, he was doing the sun crossword or whatever it was. And so she relaxed, and we got through it. But years later, I met her, and she said to me, "I can remember that day very, very well." She says, "I had been taken in by security in the prison, and they said to me, 'Here's what you can do and what you can't do,' and said, you need to watch because these boys will rape you." So that's why we set a prison officer on me, which was a lot of nonsense. And these are this, that, and the other. But anyway, so she went home to her husband. She said to him, and her husband says, "What was he like?" And she says, "What do you mean?" She says, "How did he treat you?" She says, "Very polite. He made me tea and all, or coffee. He said, 'Do you want tea or coffee?' And he gave me tea and coffee and biscuits." And said, "Well then, did it match up with what the prison officer said?" She says, "No." She says, "How do you not know? Or how do you know they weren't, weighing it up?" So she told me, as I went for coffee with her one day because I went to Open University to get stuff when I got out, and she was just happened to be in it, and she was really pleased to see me, but wanted to talk to me because she really wanted to get this out. And that was the sort of things we'd done, but they were treated very, very well. So were any teachers who come in to just take classes or to teach O levels or whatever, and they were treated well. But that was the problem. The problem was that everybody thought that we were these sorts of people. And I said to them, "Look, listen, these doors are open at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they're closed again at 9 o'clock by the staff." And I says, "And the rest of the time, they sit out there in the bunk." And I says, "And none of us is allowed to go. You have to be an officer to go to the gate. And if I want something and I'm not an officer, I have to ask the officer to go and get me something, or whatever it is, make requests and stuff like that." So no, it was really well run. And Gusty came up with that whole idea, supported by the official IRA and the provisional IRA and the UDA at that time. So from that point of view, we had a brilliant system. It worked. It educated people. If you didn't want to do it, you didn't want to do it. You didn't have to do it. But people were encouraged to do it, And this is the difficulty. The difficulty is that lots of people missed out on it, and I know at least 2 people when they got out started doing studying outside, and then went on to university to do degrees. But they didn't do it in the campaigns. I don't know why. I've never asked them. It's not really concerning, but they could have done it while they were in long case and had it forgotten out, but they didn't do it. But there was plenty of people in those compounds, in UVF compounds, who had all of those. And a close friend of mine, Eddie Kinners, he was in the Red Hand, but this guy had a PhD, and there was only BBC computers at the time, and he developed a gait analysis through his PhD, and he died of cancer just after he finished it. And it's being used in the Musgrave Park Hospital for anybody who lost limbs or things, and they still use that gait analysis. He developed that. He wrote the language for it. He used a BBC computer to do it, and he wrote the whole paper. And he was supported by a professor in Musgrave Park Hospital. And they obviously used it when he did it, but they have developed it now. But it was all developed from him writing that language on a computer to do gait analysis. So there was lots of things coming along, Cash. It was a different lifestyle in terms of, because Gusty had everybody, buying into this. So you could go to the gym, you could run, you could walk, you could do whatever you liked, but he always encouraged people to do that. But he also encouraged people to at least read, and if not read, to do some sort of informal education or formal. And he set all that up. And it was, from my point of view, I thought it was, it was great because it gave people opportunities. to do. And people laugh at me. I used to say like that people, there wasn't enough hours in a day for me, because I ended up running Long Cash at one stage after Gusty retired, and I was studying the Open University. Anna was training. I was doing 15 mile a day, 10 mile in the morning, 5 mile in the afternoon around the compound. So you can see it in that much time in a day. When people go, I says, I had like more hours in the day, but we didn't have them. But it was that I filled the day with stuff like that. And, in Long Cash, I ended up negotiating with the NIO in Whitehall. About 86, they came and said that the city hospital was draining the money, and they needed to get it finished. And I said, what's that got to do with us? And he says, you're draining the money. And I says, why? And they said, well, do you know how much it costs us to keep war dogs here? I said, yes, you feed them in raw meat, so it's probably costing you more than it costs to feed us. And so anyway, they reduced the figures and all the rest of it and said, we need you to move. So myself and a guy called Pat Thompson, who was a Republican, and he was leader of the Provisionals in the conference, and he was from bonded country. And he said to me, what's going on? And I said, well, my understanding is that this Australian diplomat who came in, he spoke to me, and then he went to his conference, spoke to him. We didn't converse, but he said, he told me that he was going to Whitehall, and did he mind if I told him what I had said? And I said, no. And Pat had said to me the next day, he said the same thing to him. And so about 2 months later, the NIO come and they said, sorry, not the NIO. NIO was there, but there's people from Whitehall. And they said to me, what's this process you're talking about? And I said, well, it's a peace process. I said, we're talking about that's where we need to get to. And there are people working on it. And so anyway, cut a long story short, this diplomat had told him what had been said by me and Pat. Now, me and Pat had never conversed, but we were saying the same things. So he had said from a Republican point of view, and I said from a Loyalist point of view. And basically what happened was they wanted to have conduits to the UVF and the IRA and UDA. And so they asked us, would we appoint anybody? So I appointed a minister called, he was a Church of Ireland minister, and you called him the Reverend William Murphy. And Pat put forward a Catholic priest who was called Father Murphy. So we used to call them the Smurfs. And they were sitting, and I can remember this because Jim McDonald came up to me on the visit, and he effing blended at me. He says, see you. I said, what's wrong with me? He says, I went down to meet them, to that priest and the minister. He says, and I was going out the revolving doors in Europa Hotel, and the pros were going in the other way. And he said to me, and they didn't know what I looked like then. I said, come off, and cut your foot, don't go around about it, and that's where we started back in 86, 87. And the others called the ceasefire in 91, and the Provisionals didn't reciprocate. In fact, they attacked pubs and housing estates, either bombed or shot people. And then we got there in 94, and that's how it worked. And Eddie Kinner, I can't see him now, but I can see him. He's up in the corner. So we had worked with that on the outside, and the outside were already working on it. But we got there in the end, and when we got to 94, it was clear. And the only reason it wasn't called before the Provost in August was because we were talking to the Irish government. Well, not the Irish government, representatives from the Republic of Ireland, and we were talking to Irish America about we'll call a ceasefire. We give us a guarantee that you're not going to fund the Provost, and you're not going to be allowing the Provost to use the Republic as a base to attack Northern Ireland. We had to wait till we got all that. We didn't get it until October, and then once we got it, a delegation was invited to meet Irish America and to meet the American administration, and that was I think it was November. I can't remember the date, but it was a date in November. So that's what came out of Long Cash. Lots of people in Long Cash, worked on that politics. Gusty encouraged us to do it. One of the bits I left out, I'll go back to it anyway, but I remember in '76 that Gusty had asked a debate about, obviously it was the common market at the time, and we had a prediction that by 1980, you know, there would be a united Europe. Now remember, this is '76, you know, and now we see, you know, now when we talk about Brexit, the reason why we had Brexit was because they didn't want a united Europe, you know, because they didn't want to live under laws from other people. But I mean, that's what we thought. Now we were well out in terms of the scale, but we did think that we're moving at a pace that we would end up with it, with some form of united Europe. And we had in that sense, because whenever you look at all the things that happened in terms of all the agreements and Maastricht and all that sort of stuff, you know, it probably was united Europe in everything but name. So from that point of view, those are the sorts of debates we had. Everybody thought that we were a university of terror, you know, all these journalists who knew nothing about Doncaster writing these stories, you know, and it couldn't have been farther from the truth. I mean, Tony wrote a book about lost opportunities, about the PUP, and, you know, I think it was '81 we received a paper from the PUP and we were asked to look at it. And I met with a couple of people who come up about the paper, and the paper was excellent. And they took it till, I can't remember who the Secretary of State was, but it was in '81. And there were 5 things in it which ended up in the Good Friday Agreement. And that was, let me try and remember them all. We needed, the paramilitaries needed to call ceasefires. Politicians needed to come together to see how we were going to move forward. The disbandment of the IEC. I can't remember what the other 2 was, but they were in there. Yes. The other one was to have a local assembly, which would be done on sharing responsibility. Sharing responsibility is how councils work. So we have committees in the council, and so the committees are run. They run each of the different things, and then we come all into a meeting and we decide whether we're going to agree or disagree. But the committees have to decide first, and they're usually mostly are agreed. So we were against power sharing, because we were saying we wanted to share responsibility. So our argument was, if we had an assembly, what we would do was we'd make the chair and the deputy chair the head of that sort of committee, but they would also be in charge of the department. So one would have to be a unionist and the other would have to be a nationalist, and that would have to be done. We thought at the time it was Sinai, but it turned out it was I can't remember any of it. So anyway, I know what it is, but it just escapes me. I'm getting too old. I forget things. But anyway, the hunt. So, and the larger parties choose the hunt when we went there in '94 or '98, because they liked it better because it worked for bigger parties rather than smaller ones. The lag was more for the old parties. But anyway, you know, so that was my experience in Long Cash. I came out with a degree, and I also had a postgraduate diploma in town planning as well, but I didn't do that, and I had to wait to get out because it wouldn't allow me to sort of measure things and stuff like that and try to put buildings in because I wasn't able to see the plans. But I mean, I had a lot of help from the tutors and stuff like that, because they just give me sites in Belfast and then I could do it that way. But so go ahead. I'll probably talk too long there, Gareth.
Talked over an hour now, so it's probably a good time to wrap up. But if
I thought it was 45 minutes. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. If there's anything else you want to address, just to finish up, or
no, I think if we've got time, Scott, people can ask questions, can't they?
Yeah, I have one question that has come in here. It's from someone in America. So they've read the book, said it's a great read, refreshing to read, something from a Protestant point of view. And they are curious about what worries or concerns you would have about the political situation in Northern Ireland today.
Well, I mean, I think that the political situation in Northern Ireland is dire. I don't think that there's any confidence in either the 2 largest parties. They don't have confidence in each other. And I suppose in terms of how this was built, it was about confidence, that you had to be confident about being able to work with people and actually get things done. And when you didn't get them done, you needed to park them, then move on, and then go back and visit them. That hasn't happened, and the Good Friday Agreement has never been implemented in full, and that's what concerns me. We've allowed the two largest parties to just cherry pick it rather than actually do what was supposed to be done. And I think, in terms of everybody blames everybody who was involved in the Good Friday Agreement about, what happened. What happened was the political parties, who were always the two strongest, actually decided not to be actually implemented in full.
Right, thanks for that. We had one other question that was put in the public chat there. So it was a bit earlier on when you were talking about sort of growing up in a working class area. And the question was, did visits down south when you were younger give you any understanding of working class culture in the Republic of Ireland?
No. I don't remember being in the Republic. I have a photograph that sits on the table in the living room, and it's of my mother and my father and my sister and brother, but I was never there. I'm telling lies, I wasn't there with my mother. That's what I meant to say. I went with my uncle and my aunt. My uncle was my mother's brother, and we used to go just across the border. And we used to stay in a cottage that was on a farm that belonged to this guy who was called Willie. And I couldn't tell you his second name, but he used to have a farm. And I went down there maybe 3 or 4 years. And I loved it. It was just, you were away, it was remote. You were about a farm, and you done all of that stuff. And I was with my cousins and stuff like that. But so I never really, I wasn't in the centre of Dublin. And I wouldn't have seen you've seen rural life, but I would never have seen that working class life. So I don't know. What I do know is, when I was very young, my father, who had friends who owned horses and worked in bookies and stuff like that, and he had a friend who wanted me to be a jockey, and I was very late. I think when I went to jail, I was about 8 stone 6 or something. But I really wanted me to be a jockey, and my mother said no. I wouldn't be. She wouldn't want me to go to a priest-ridden state. And my father was saying, "Look, he's just gone down, and they're going to train him to be a jockey and all that sort of stuff." But that was put on hold. They wouldn't let me. My mother wouldn't let me. She wasn't letting me out of her sight. But no, so I didn't really have an experience of a republic except that rural one, which was very small, and it was on that farm. So I wouldn't have known what was going on, outside that rural community. But I enjoyed the time in it. So from that point of view, I really loved it. Like going down and playing in the fields and riding horses and stuff like that. Even though I fell off, but still enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I will hand back to you if you've got anything else you'd like to go through.
Just to remind people that the book's still available. It's been selling really well. It's had a good reception, as Billy outlined earlier. So, if you want to read it, you should be able to pick it up in Waterstones or No Alibis if you're in Belfast, or Belfast Books, and just the usual online retailers that people know about. So, and just thanks again for having us. Really appreciate it, and giving us the opportunity to talk about the book.
No problem. I would like to thank Billy and Gareth for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us and given up a part of your evening to come and hear what I thought personally was a really interesting discussion. And I'm sure there's much more we could have gone through, and maybe we'll get the pair of you back someday to talk about what happened later in Billy's life. Or of course, people can just go and pick up a copy of the book if they want to find out. We can run these events without the support of everybody that comes along. So I'd like to extend an invitation to you all to visit linenhall.com, our website. You can view our program of upcoming events, find out more about becoming a member of the library. And I would just like to say, enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
So Scott, just before we finish up,
Yeah.
can I just, on behalf of me and Gareth, I just want to thank everybody who took the time to listen tonight, and I hope that you weren't bored. I hope you found it interesting. But we didn't get a chance to do these things, and we're all doing them now because of COVID. But we had planned loads of this, and I think we'll probably continue if there's if people want to do it. So I'm glad that Lynn Hall has done it tonight, and I'm glad, Scott, that we maybe come back and do the later years. So I just want to finish by saying, listen, we live in a divided society, and we need to sort it out. Because we know we live in a divided society, so we need to find a political way forward that suits both. But I think there's a way to go before we even get there. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming on.
Thank you, Billy. Great note to end on. Thank you very much.